Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. We welcome you to this Elder Justice Initiative webinar, Forensic Markers of Physical Abuse and Neglect, Prosecution. As with all technology, we may at some time experience a momentary lapse in the webinar session. In the event of a problem, please be patient with us, and the webinar should resume shortly. I do want to take a moment. So if you have a technical problem, or please type a private chat message to the technical specialist, Danielle, in the feedback box. If you cannot access the chat, you can also send Danielle an email at dmclean@ovcttac.org. That's dmclean@ovcttac.org. If you have questions come up throughout the webinar, please type them to us in the chat box. We'll be addressing questions throughout the webinar and also take any remaining time at the end to address as many questions as possible. We also want to note that today's session is being recorded. It'll be made available on the OVC-TTAC training website and the Elder Justice website as well. Due to the nature of the topic we're covering today, we do want to take a moment to note that there may be photos and images that some can find disturbing. Please use your discretion when viewing. And at this time, I'm going to turn things over to our host, Dr. Sid Stahl, a consultant with the Elder Justice Initiative at the U.S. Department of Justice. Sid.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is Sid Stahl. Today's webinar is with Dr. Laura Mosqueda and Ms. Paige Ulrey. The title is Forensic Markers of Physical Abuse and Neglect, Documentation for Prosecution. The Elder Justice, and it's part of the Elder Justice Initiative, the mission of which is to support and coordinate Department of Justice's enforcement and programmatic efforts to combat elder abuse, neglect, and financial fraud and scams that target older adults. The Elder Justice Initiative accomplishes this using four goals. One is promoting justice for older adults, helping older victims and their families, enhancing state and local efforts through training and resources. And today's webinar addresses the last of these goals, that is supporting, organizing, and presenting research to improve elder abuse practice and policy. All of these goals are met in part by the mechanism that has been created by the Department of Justice called the elderjustice.gov webpage, and at your leisure, we invite you to investigate the various aspects of that web page. Today's Elder Abuse Initiative, or Elder Justice Initiative, will be presented by Dr. Laura Mosqueda and Ms. Paige Ulrey. And it's a pleasure to introduce these two to you for today's webinar on forensic markers, physical abuse, and documenting physical abuse for prosecution. We're very fortunate to have two of the leaders in the field who are responsible for very different and important related aspects of elder abuse. Dr. Mosqueda is a professor of family medicine and geriatrics at the Keck School of Medicine, University of Southern California, and a professor of gerontology at USC's Leonard Davis School of Gerontology. She's internationally known for expertise in person-centered care for older adults and her extensive work on elder abuse. Dr. Mosqueda also directs the National Center on Elder Abuse and is widely published in the field of elder mistreatment. Ms. Ulrey is a senior deputy prosecuting attorney at the King County Prosecutor's Office in Seattle, Washington, where she is a member of the office's Elder Abuse Unit. She specializes in the prosecution of elder financial exploitation and adult neglect. Nationally, she's involved in protocol development and training for the Office on Violence Against Women, and has conducted training for the National District Attorneys Association, the Office of Victims of Crime, and the National Institute of Justice. We're very pleased and honored to have two such distinguished experts with us today in this field. Laura, Paige, all yours.
Thank you, Sid. It's a pleasure to be here with everybody today, and I think we'll get started. I first want to say how much I've learned from probably a lot of the people or types of people who are on the call, whether it's folks in Quincy, Illinois, or Bucks County, Pennsylvania, or ombudsmen like Lynette Fujitani, or APS workers, especially in Orange County, California, detectives like Cher Hill, and certainly prosecutors like Paige Ulrey and Paul Greenwood. It really has informed the work that I've done as a geriatrician in this area. What I'll note is that as we go along, I'll be talking about a variety of things, including just a quick overview of age-related changes that make older adults a bit more susceptible to abuse and neglect, and some indicators that raise suspicion, along with covering forensic markers, specifically pressure sores and bruises. We'll talk a little bit about laboratory data, the care and feeding of your physician expert for those who are detectives and prosecutors, and some issues related to working as a team. Paige will be interjecting at times along the way, and we'll also be asking you to have some participation. People might notice that near the top of their screen there's a little person with their hand up, and at times I'll be asking you to vote on something or just to raise your hand, depending on whether or not you agree with the statement, and hopefully that will also help keep you awake. So everybody, let's jump right in and get going. As many of you know, or perhaps personally realize, as our age increases, the number of health and social and psychological issues also increase. Chronic illnesses, and typically it's not just one chronic illness, it might be several at one time, like high blood pressure and Parkinson's disease and diabetes, which then leads to an increasing number of medications. We also find a lot of mental health issues such as depression and anxiety that occur. As we're all aware, Alzheimer's disease and other dementias certainly become much more common as we get older. In fact, it's estimated that close to half of people over the age of 85 have some form of a dementing illness. And finally, I'll just mention that the quantity and quality of social support changes as we age. And it's not hard, I think, to imagine why these things can combine to make older adults more susceptible to undue influence, physical abuse, sexual assault, neglect, etc. But it also can be very hard to tell what the heck is going on. And part of that is because of these common changes, and some are normal changes that occur as we age. And just a few examples are that bone density goes down as we age, particularly in women, but in men as well. Many people are familiar with the term osteoporosis, which describes the disease state of a low bone density. In the brain, our reaction time goes down a bit. Brain and nervous system, our memory goes down. In the skin, also known as the integument, the outer layer of our skin becomes thinner. Our capillaries become more fragile. And in our sensory system, we may have hearing loss, which is called presbycusis, the hearing loss of old age, and changes in our vision. So now you can begin to think about, well, of course they have a broken bone. They're old. Of course they have a bruise. They're old. We can't believe anything they say. They have memory loss. They've got Alzheimer's disease. They make a bad witness. They can't see or they can't report what happened because they can't see or hear. And it starts to make the diagnosis of abuse and neglect harder and harder to do. And in fact, what I find as a practicing geriatrician is that whenever I see an older adult with an injury, I can almost always find a reason other than abuse or neglect to say that this is what happened. So how do we start to sort that out and be useful to folks in social services and in the criminal justice system? Well, one thing I look for, what we call, I hesitate to call them red flags these days. I call them pink flags, things that make me a little nervous, like something is going on. Explanations that just don't make sense. Yes, people can fall, but why do they have an injury that looks like that? A delay in seeking care. Yes, people can get pressure sores, but why did you wait till it was down to the bone before doing anything about it? Injuries that are unexplained. Stories that seem to be changing. And what I really look for oftentimes in older adults who have a dementing illness is a sudden change in behavior, which is almost always a medical problem until proven otherwise. And one of the what we have is what we call a differential diagnosis in medicine when we're looking at something going on, trying to figure out what the heck it is. On our differential diagnosis with a sudden change in behavior is elder abuse as a possibility. Now, what's important is not just looking at these injuries or looking at these pink flags, but understanding the context in which they occurred. I commonly get photos that people will send me of something like a pressure sore or some other wound with a question saying, hey, do you think this was abuse? And what I usually need is the context. Well, what were the circumstances? What were they trying to, what was the caregiver trying to do or not trying to do when they should have been? What was this person's medical status? What medications are they on? What are all their chronic illnesses? I will say, though, that sometimes I will see some photos where I'll say, this has got to be abuse or neglect until proven otherwise. It just is so bad, so far out of what you would normally see, that I would almost have to be shown why it's not abuse or neglect. This happens more in neglect, quite frankly, than in physical abuse. And even though we won't be going into it in detail, just a quick reminder about some interviewing tips. When we're interviewing older adults, having a calm, quiet, and familiar environment, whenever possible, interviewing the person in their own home, not having a lot of chaos going on, making sure that the potential perpetrator is not standing there or close by. Watching the person's body language. Are they cringing when a particular person comes by? Do they seem to be very withdrawn when particular people are in the room? Compensating for sensory deficits, so that if they have glasses, that they're wearing them, that you're positioned so that they can see your mouth. If they have hearing aids, are they in? If they're in, are they on? If they're on, do they have batteries in them? All these sorts of things really make a difference when you're trying to have a good interview. And being very aware of our own tone and attitude and body language. What is it we're communicating to the older adult we're seeing? Are we communicating, hey, hurry it up, we're in a rush? I think one of the most important and difficult things it is to do, because we're all busy, is to just sit there and be with somebody so that they know you're really fully present with them, and to allow them to tell their story in the way that they need to tell it, because they often have been through a very traumatic event. So I'm going to go on and talk about pressure sores, but Paige, was there anything else you wanted to add into what I've said so far?
I don't think so, Laura. I think this is really thorough.
Okay. This is why I like Paige Ulrey. All right. So now we're going to talk a little bit about pressure sores, and I just want to remind you about why they are and what they are. They're caused when the skin and underlying tissue is not getting sufficient oxygen. So for whatever reason, could be from pressure forces or friction or shearing forces, the blood supply to that area has been cut off, and it's been cut off for long enough that that tissue begins to die. And we talk about several different stages, 1 through 4, and sometimes unstageable. And if there's time, we can talk about suspected deep tissue injury, but we might not want to be talking about that today. We can see as we go along with our conversation here, everybody. So this first is more of a cartoon slide that tells you about the pressure sores. What you'll see is in a stage 1 sore, there is you have the outer layer of skin which is not disrupted, but it tends to look red. And in a stage 2 sore, that outer layer is disrupted. In a stage 3 sore, there is enough disruption that it's gone through the skin, what we call the dermis, into subcutaneous fat. And in a stage 4 sore, it's all the way down to muscle, tendon, or bone. And we all tend to say, oh my gosh, stage 4 sores are absolutely horrible, and they are. But remember, in some older adults who are emaciated, the distance from the outer layer of skin to muscle, tendon, or bone might be very tiny. It might only be 1/8 of an inch. So this is why even when stage 4 sores sound horrible, we have to take the context into account. This is a slightly more graphic way of showing the same issues related to the different stages of pressure sores. Again, we tend to see redness with a stage 1, a disruption of the epidermis in a stage 2. We're through the dermal layer, through the skin in a stage 3, down into the fatty layer, and in a stage 4, all the way down to muscle, tendon, or bone. I am going to now show a few slides that I think will be disturbing for many people with actual pictures of pressure sores. There will be 3 slides with that, so I just wanted to give everybody a warning. So here is an example of a stage 2 decubitus ulcer or pressure sore. And what you'll see here is that the bed of this is clean and red, and it looks like nice healthy tissue underneath that you would expect to be healing up pretty well. When somebody sends me a photo like this, I'm going to want to know, well, hey, is this what it looked like when the person was brought in? Or is this after they've been in the hospital and it's been cleaned up? This next photo is the kind of thing people will send me and say, hey, was this from abuse or neglect? So I'm just curious right now, by a show of hands, if you can look up in your little box up there with a little person having their hand up, I'd like for people to vote, do you think this was due to abuse or a neglectful sort of situation? So raise your hand if you think it was. Okay. So it looks like most people are raising their hand. And I would agree, I'd be really, really concerned about this. I will say, though, that there are times when you can see something that looks this bad, and there is a reasonable explanation. And the kinds of things I would be looking at in terms of the context are, did the caregiver know this was going on? Were they doing anything about it? And despite the fact of making best efforts, it was still getting worse. It may be this person had a severe nutritional deficiency or other medical problems that could help us understand what was happening. If they were taking proper actions to try to prevent it from getting worse, were they also making sure that this person's pain was being relieved? So all of these things would factor in when I'm looking at a photo such as this. And again, emphasizes that even though it looks horrible, we need to have the context behind it. And the final difficult photo I'll show was actually an autopsy photo. And this one really looks horrendous for a variety of reasons. You'll see that this person is emaciated, that we have some large wounds that were oozing and actually have been covered in pus, and they have sores all along their back. So this is the kind of thing where I'd be very highly suspicious that this was due to neglect, and want to have a lot of information to explain to me how it wasn't in order for me to believe that. So I'm going to just pause for a moment here to let Paige weigh in a little bit. She and I have worked on some cases together that have involved pressure sores. So what are some of your thoughts and observations?
Well, Laura, first, one thing that comes up for me a lot in these neglect cases is prosecutors and law enforcement wanting to know, how long did it take for this wound to occur? And obviously, it's important for us to be able to establish that the caregiver was ignoring this for a lengthy period of time before either they got help or before it was discovered. Can you just talk about what research or lack thereof exists with regard to that?
Yeah, there is very little research on this, but I would also explain that in terms of the how long question, that's difficult to answer for a variety of reasons because a pressure sore can form fairly quickly, or it can take a long time depending on the person's functional status, nutritional status, and medical problems and their circumstances in lying wherever it is they've been lying. So we, typically I think people like me frustrate people like you because you say, how long did it occur? And we give our usual, I don't know, kind of answer. But I also have found that sometimes it's not that important to know. What you need to know is not exactly, was it 2.5 days ago? But oftentimes I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, the question is, could this have occurred overnight like they said it did? And that's when I'm often able to say, no way, no how did it occur in that kind of a time frame. And even though I can't tell you if it took 8 days or 12 days for this to form, I can tell you it didn't occur overnight like this person said it did. And then I can give you very solid information as to why I would not believe it occurred in that time frame. Is that the kind of thing you're talking about?
Exactly, and I think usually we can do fine in a trial situation as long as we've got a general window of time during which you think that pressure sore would have developed. And the fact that it was 7 to 14 days is usually enough for us to work with. The concern obviously is, just like you said, that someone would claim it happened overnight and the perpetrator simply didn't have time to even respond to it. Laura, what about other signs? I mean, if I'm looking at a case I get with a victim who's got some pressure sores, what else should we be reviewing to determine whether or not these pressure sores were caused by neglect versus underlying disease?
Well, so I think getting the medical records is really, really important. I know some of the cases I've been involved in with this neglect is the caregiver says, well, she didn't want to go to the doctor. But then an investigator will find out that before that caregiver moved in with mom, that mom had been going to the doctor pretty regularly. And I know that's the kind of information you will often get and let me know about. So I'll want to know, yeah, there are other medical problems, and the other thing I'm really interested in is their functional status. What do we know about their mobility? And if this person up until 2 days before their death was supposed to have been walking around, then why would they have developed these horrible pressure sores so quickly? Because immobility should be more associated with pressure sores. And then the other thing I'd mention that I really like to know about is what kind of equipment was at home. Was there any sort of special mattress? Was anything being done related to wound care? What are some of the other things you're thinking about?
Also, I think the number and frequency, the number and location of pressure sores is really important. Is that not true?
Yeah, that is true. Location is really important. And because sometimes I'll know, like, this is a really unusual place for a pressure sore to form. I'm thinking of one case where I saw where somebody had a pressure sore on the inside of their thigh. And that's not a common pressure point. So what in the world was going on, to cause it there? So yes, location, number, size, depth are all very important.
Another question that I hear a lot is, well, if this victim had dementia, so is it possible that she didn't feel any pain as a result of these pressure sores?
Yeah, I'm so glad you bring that up. It is remarkable to me that we so often dehumanize people who have dementing illnesses that we think that they don't feel pain, and that is absolutely not true. So people with dementia, if anything, I think can have more suffering as a result because they don't even understand what the heck is going on. So people with dementia absolutely do feel pain, and pressure sores absolutely are painful. Yeah. Anything else? Are there any questions that the DOJ team sees coming in related to pressure sores that I should address right now?
There are two questions. This is Sid Stahl. There are two questions on the bottom in the question box. Can these issues be exacerbated by other pathology? Or Dr. Duffy raised the issue, or are there mental health issues related to it?
Yeah. So they can be exacerbated by other pathology. So for example, if right now I'm doing house calls on somebody who has very advanced metastatic bladder cancer. And so we have a special bed ordered, but that pathology, might lead to her having some pressure sores. We're going to do our darndest to stop it from happening, but it might happen before she actually passes away. So that might be one extreme example. But people who are malnourished also are more prone to have sores and also have difficulty of having their sores heal. So that would be some examples. Related to the mental health issues, that's a really interesting point as well. People who have severe mental health issues as the older adult, for example, might not want to go along with whatever program you have in order to provide appropriate wound care. Or you can have mental health issues on the part of the caregiver so that they're simply unable to provide appropriate care. And Paige, I might actually hand it over to you there for a minute in terms of what you do in those cases.
Yeah, we've had a lot of referrals over the years of cases where people with mental health or developmental disabilities, mental health issues or developmental disabilities ended up being in charge of aging parents or aging relatives and becoming, over time, responsible for their care. And it's really problematic. It's very difficult for us as prosecutors to figure out whether in those cases prosecution is appropriate. So we end up doing a pretty exhaustive investigation, not only into the victim situation and the victim's medical history, but also into the suspect's situation, whether or not they're working, whether or not they have any diagnosed or treated or untreated mental health issues, essentially to figure out whether they have the capacity to provide proper care to this person. And we've had a number of cases where, despite the fact that the victim really died in situations that no one would claim are anything other than neglect, we were unable to prosecute because the adult children who were caring for that person simply did not have the wherewithal mentally to step in and provide proper care. And we've had similar situations with adult children with developmental disabilities. So I guess I would just put out a word of caution to prosecutors in these cases, and just to make sure that when we are prosecuting them, we're really prosecuting cases where the caregiver had the capacity emotionally, intellectually, and physically to provide care to that person. It's very easy to, once we start realizing sort of the atrocities that happen to older people in our society, it's very easy to become very zealous in prosecuting these cases. And I think we just need to be cautious that we are really making sure that we are prosecuting people who had the ability to get proper care for this victim, even if they couldn't provide it themselves.
Thanks for mentioning that. All right, I'm going to move on pretty quickly here to some bruising work that we've done, and this is a lilac-breasted roller, a bird that to me looks like a bruise. Don't tell the bird that, but there we go. So we did a couple studies on bruising, and don't worry about the colors of the bruises on here, just look at the location. And this was where we did one study that looked at what happens in bruising if it's just accidental. And then we did another study that looked at what happens in bruising if actually a victim of abuse. And a big thank you to the Orange County California Adult Protective Service group, without whom we could not have done these studies. So let me just show you for a comparison. This is anterior, or the front of the body. And what you'll notice here is a lot more bruising on the head and on the upper arms and torso and upper legs in people who have been abused. So you can see a distinct difference there. And if you look at the posterior, or the back of people, you'll see also a different pattern where you see bruising up on the neck, again, torso, buttocks area, and you rarely see that in people who have not been abused. So it began to tell us that, even though you can't definitely say somebody was abused based on the location, we at least now can begin to say, look, this is a suspicious pattern. We found that really large bruises, multiple bruises, and bruises in these locations were more consistent with bruising due to abuse. And this can be especially important in people who have dementia, who really can't tell us what happened. So this is going to be now back to your turn to raise your hand. This bruise is on the front of somebody's shin. And I'd like for you to raise your hand if you think this bruise was accidental. If this bruise was accidental, raise your hand. Yeah, most people are raising their hand. Good job, peoples. And I would agree with you. That's a really common place to bump yourself, and doesn't make me too worried. Let's go to the next slide. And this is a slide of, you can see somebody who has bruising on on their side, and you can see it in multiple areas here, here, and here. Raise your hand if you think that this was an accidental bruise. Okay, a couple people are raising their hand, and the rest aren't or are asleep. Either one is possible, I recognize. And the reason I would agree, I'd be really worried about this. This is a hard place to just get a bruise accidentally, and I'd want to hear a really consistent story about how somebody had their arm up and fell against a dresser or something, where at least we would have some congruence between the history and the physical findings. And finally, this slide, which I have my colleague Diana Homeyer to thank for some of these photos. Do you think, raise your hand if you think this person, these bruises were accidental in this person? And again, people are either asleep or correct, or both. And this, of course, would be very concerning. Multiple bruises all over the chest, and as you can see on the arm as well. So very, very kind of concerning. So the message here is you can begin to understand that certain bruising patterns are more consistent with abuse, and we need to really be on the lookout for it. And we're really encouraging healthcare professionals to not just accept, well, Dad fell, and that's why he has a bruise, but to ask more questions. So just to go back to neglect for a minute, the kinds of things I'm looking for when I have a concern about neglect are, does the person look malnourished? Are they in filthy condition? It seems like we're giving them the right kind of medication, but these medical issues aren't just getting better. Maybe it's because they're not actually getting the treatment that we're prescribing. Is the caregiver missing appointments or just seem disengaged, isn't following up? So these all might be signs of neglect. I do want to give a quick mention to what we can tell from laboratory data. As many of you know, whenever we're looking at a case of abuse or neglect, the medical expert is going to want to take a look at blood test results, and we're going to want to know what the EMT said, and was it intravenous fluids were they administered on the way to the hospital, so that we're able to look at things like chemistry panels, blood counts, medication levels, and a variety of direct and indirect indications that might tell us whether somebody was on a medication. So for example, if this patient has been on hospice and they've been in a lot of pain and they're supposed to have been receiving morphine, and you find a 0 level of morphine, that might indicate that, that it wasn't being given to them when it should have been. So these are all the kinds of things that we're looking at when we're bugging you for laboratory tests. And the kinds of things I consider when I'm being asked to look at abuse or neglect is what were the vulnerabilities and their functional status, what was going on with the caregiver. I don't do this too much because I've really come to understand more and more that this is a job of the detectives and prosecutors, but it does help me get a clue. The explanations make sense. What was their pattern of prior healthcare usage? And for me, it's really getting that context and putting the pieces of the puzzle together. Because as a clinician, I live in this gray area most of the time. People want to know if it was abuse or neglect, and I'm like, I'm not really sure. It's pretty gray. It's hard to tell. But I do know that once I'm asked to testify as an expert, I have to really be willing to say, hey, this was neglect. And I have to really believe it and know why I believe it so that I'm able to do a good job on behalf of the investigators and prosecutors. So the challenge really becomes that there's no single, we can't do a blood test and say, yep, the blood test shows it was abuse. We have to rely on forensic markers and putting the puzzle together. And generally, we as a group, as a field, we're not that well trained in how to look for it. And so we're all trying to do a better job. I know among physicians, we really struggle with making a diagnosis and even putting it on our radar so that we pick it up when it's present. And we clearly need more and better research. What I'll mention before I just turn it over to Paige is that our partnerships are invaluable, and sometimes they do feel a bit like this when we're struggling with each other. And depending on the day, you're either this bird or this pelican, but that the partnerships are critically important so that we can learn from each other and, more importantly, do a better job of serving these susceptible older adults who we're all here to serve. So with that, I'll turn it over to Paige and apologize for going a couple minutes over my time there, Paige.
It's fine, Laura. And I just want to echo what you said. You know, especially with regard to neglect, which is so completely medically oriented, we simply couldn't prosecute these cases without you all. And going back to, Laura, what you were saying about when is something neglect versus poor care, for us, you know, even if a doctor says this is neglect, it doesn't necessarily mean that we can prosecute it. So what we're looking at is our respective state statutes to see whether or not this act in front of us fits the elements of that statute. And in my experience, I tend to prosecute only felony level neglect, so I'm definitely looking at this from that lens. But we tend to only prosecute those cases involving severe neglect where there are multiple severe pressure sores, oftentimes death, leading to death, and also other signs of neglect like poor hygiene, poor dentition, malnutrition, dehydration, usually a cluster of signs that the person was not getting any proper care, much less proper care for their pressure sores. And then we're also looking for a case where we don't have so many systemic failures that the defense attorney is inevitably going to be saying, well, yeah, it may be okay to prosecute my client, but you should also have all these other entities at the table. And sadly, what we see in a lot of these cases, because our system is not doing a very good job of caring for older people, are situations where a number of different agencies or individuals failed the victim. And if you have a lot of that going on in a case, it can make singling out one person to prosecute problematic, both ethically and practically. And then the other thing that has ended up becoming more and more important to me as I've done these cases is being able to prove a motive, and usually it's a financial motive. So where you have a caregiver who simply is, for whatever reason, passive and not very engaged with the care of the person who they are responsible for, we often don't see juries getting as upset about those cases as they need to be to convict. But where we can show that the caregiver had some financial motive to keep the victim in the home, to not get them the care they needed, that's usually where we can get juries to convict. So that's, for me, a very important factor in these cases. Okay, so I'm going to move on. And I'm just going to talk for a few minutes about the vital role of healthcare providers in our prosecution of elder abuse. And just first of all, just to give people a sense of the lay of the land in this sort of bleak world of elder abuse prosecution, most of the victims in our cases tend to be suffering from some degree of dementia. Only half, as Laura said, of people over 85 have dementia. But the people who tend to be victimized in elder abuse tend to most often be suffering from it. In many of our cases, those victims don't have dementia that's diagnosed, so they're usually living in their own home still, and oftentimes their family members aren't aware of the fact that they've got significant impairment of some kind. The other thing is that they're usually isolated, so we don't often have witnesses to our cases besides the victim themselves. The most common defenses that are raised to different forms of elder abuse are listed in the slide. In neglect, what we hear most often from defendants or perpetrators is that the victim didn't want medical care. I was just following their wishes. So it's a form of a consent defense. In a physical abuse case, it's usually that the victim fell or the injury was caused by some kind of accident. In a sexual abuse case, we're back to consent, where the perpetrator claims the victim wanted to participate in whatever the sexual act is at issue. And in a financial abuse case, the defense is also usually consent, that the victim wanted me to have their money. I was the only one who was there for them. I was the one they really cared about. So you can see that in each of these cases, we're really having to put together the pieces of evidence to try to figure out if A, a crime occurred, and B, if we can prove that crime. And it's made particularly problematic because consent is a legitimate defense. I mean, it's true that you have the right to refuse medical care if you have capacity. You have the right to have sexual contact with who you want to, and you have the right to do with your money what you want. So In each of these cases, we're really having to look beyond whether or not the victim consented to whether or not their consent was obtained through some form of undue influence, or whether they lacked the cognitive capacity to consent to whatever is at issue. And when you no longer have a victim who's available to you by the time of trial or by the time of the investigation, that can get really complicated. So these are just the different pieces of evidence we try to look at in these cases to figure out if we've got a criminal case. And I would say records of and interviews with victims' healthcare providers are #1 most important in virtually all of our cases. We're also looking at bank records, usually of the victim and suspect, APS records. We're getting capacity evaluations in many of our cases. We're talking to civil attorneys who may have been involved. This long list is unfortunately a pretty typical list of the kinds of evidence we're looking for in most of our cases. And the doctor, the nurse practitioner, or the physician's assistant who is treating an elder abuse patient is often the only person that victim is coming into regular contact with, due to their isolation, due to the fact that oftentimes the perpetrator is intentionally keeping them at home and keeping them away from family and friends. So that healthcare provider is all the more essential to us because they may be the one person who is observing the injuries on the victim, seeing pressure sores or other signs of neglect, detecting trauma or other mental symptoms of any kind of abuse the victim might be going through, and also detecting cognitive impairment. We also see doctors or healthcare providers as sometimes being the only person that victims are willing to confide in because they trust them so much. And Laura, please jump in here at any point. But we use healthcare providers in a number of ways in these cases. We use them to help us determine causation of injuries, to help us figure out whether signs and symptoms that we're seeing on a victim are consistent with neglect, to help us figure out whether a victim had capacity to consent to an act that's at issue, and also to help us figure out whether criminal charges are appropriate. I have called Laura Mosqueda on a number of occasions and simply asked her, do you think it's appropriate to file charges in this case? Like, I know you think this was neglect, but a separate question for me is this egregious enough, and is this the kind of case that we think the justice system should be getting involved with? And getting the perspective of someone like Laura or another geriatrician who sees these cases on occasion can be a very helpful read for us as to whether or not charging is appropriate.
And one thing I'll just mention, Paige, and because some of the questions are coming in related to this a bit as well, while we're not going to be going into capacity too much and documentation of that, at least on this webinar, we have been, the Department of Justice has sponsored some work done as a collaborative between USC and Cornell, where we've worked on a tool for better documentation of injuries that we're going to start spreading nationwide. We hopefully will be taken up by primary care physicians and emergency room physicians in particular, that hopefully down the line will make your job easier, that when you go back to look at records, you'll have some better documentation of the injury itself.
Right. I'm just seeing a comment from someone, Skip Swain, talking about how a lot of doctors that Skip deals with don't like to complete capacity declarations and probably don't like to do assessments at all or screening at all for dementia. And that's definitely something that my colleague Amanda Froh and I deal with in our cases quite frequently, is where there's a patient with ongoing memory issues where the primary care provider simply kind of writes it off and says, well, this is just old age, or it appears for whatever reason to be reluctant to do any real assessment of that incapacity. Can you comment on that, Laura?
Yeah, well, I think, this gets to a bigger issue, which is we as healthcare providers need to do a better job of identifying and diagnosing dementing illnesses. And I think we're better at it than we used to be, but still nowhere close to where we want to be. And so there unfortunately still is oftentimes a tendency to just say the person has memory loss and not to really look into it and make an actual diagnosis and figure out if it's reversible. On the capacity piece, I would say that most of us physicians, unless we've really been trained in it, aren't very good at assessing capacity. I know that I can assess capacity for certain things, but I will often rely on a geropsychologist or a neuropsychologist to help with the capacity assessment, And the final thing I'll mention, at least in California, our CAPDEC form, our capacity declaration form, is horrible. It's confusing. It's not well written. I'm sorry. I hope I'm not offending anybody. But it really needs a major update. And I think what ends up happening is physicians don't understand or take the time to understand the importance of this form and the consequences of filling out this form. And I certainly have seen copies of these forms that were really not filled out well at all. So I would love to be in a world where we're doing a better job getting capacity assessed by the right people at the right time, and we really need to move in that direction.
And what we end up doing in our cases is most of the time trying to find a geriatric psychiatrist or a geriatric psychologist who can do an evaluation. And I know I'm lucky to be in a big jurisdiction, and in some smaller ones it's very difficult to find those people. But in many cases we simply don't have sufficient documentation of the dementia in the primary care provider's records to be able to proceed on that theory without something more thorough being done with the victim. But sometimes we will have a case where we can find someone who's able to sort of look at the medical records and look at the interviews on the case and help give an opinion at trial, even if they weren't able to do an evaluation of the victim at the time or close to the time of the incident. Right. And yep. Sometimes family witnesses obvious signs of cognitive impairment, so that we're able to proceed even if we don't have a thorough evaluation that was done close to the time.
And I know I've seen some records where you'll look back years prior and find somewhere hidden that somebody was on a medication that's only use is for memory loss.
That's right.
It already starts to indicate, hey, 3 years ago somebody was worried enough that they put them on a medication for this. So no, it didn't just happen last week.
Exactly, and usually we also see changes in how they're providing care for themselves, changes in their keeping track of their financial records. If you do a thorough enough investigation, you can often find clues to that dementia that really might corroborate an opinion by an expert later on that they were most likely suffering from it at the time of the crime. Just a reminder, too, that healthcare providers are not only essential with regard to information about dementia, but any statements made by a victim to a healthcare provider that's made for purposes of medical treatment is admissible later on at trial, even if we don't have that victim available to testify. So if doctors or nurses will take notes of what it is the victim said to them about the abuse, that can be really crucial evidence for us further down the line. And the same with statements made by the caregiver, if that is the person we end up charging with abuse. Those statements made to anyone can be admitted as a statement of a party opponent, regardless of whether or not that person testifies. So again, really crucial evidence for us when we end up charging a case. So that's one of the things we ask for from healthcare providers is thorough documentation of those statements that I just mentioned, photographing injuries and signs of neglect, documenting any concerns of dementia. And then there are some basic screening tools that more and more healthcare providers are administering that don't really give you a thorough assessment of a patient's cognitive impairment, but do give you a good idea of whether or not there's some clues about dementia and whether or not they should be referred on for a more thorough assessment. And the two that I think are the most effective, at least for purposes of my cases, and I think, Laura, you agree with this, are the St. Louis University Mental Status Exam, the SLUMS test, and then the MOCA, the Montreal Cognitive Assessment test. Both of those assess not only for memory loss, but also executive function, and therefore really help us get at whether or not a victim had capacity to consent to whatever's at issue in the case. Any comment on that, Laura?
Yeah, I tend to use the MOCA, and again, this is a pretty brief screening tool. So I will use this, and sometimes it's just obvious the person is really bombing it, and they're bombing it in all the areas that are related to that higher level decision making that you need in order to make complicated financial transactions, et cetera, and it ain't subtle. And in which case I'm really able to see to tell that. And sometimes I'm writing, this is not in an abuse case, but I'll be willing to write a letter saying the person lacks capacity in order to help trigger something like a power of attorney. When it's more subtle and it's difficult, I turn to my colleagues, typically in neuropsychology or geropsychology, to do the much more detailed testing in difficult to determine kinds of cases. I will also say that a lot of times by the time I'm seeing them, it's pretty obvious too.
Right.
And it isn't so subtle. So I do think there's a lot that well-trained healthcare professionals can do. But the other thing that worries me is if you don't know how to do this test, it's worse to just try to do one and get bad information than to not do one at all.
Yep. I know we're running short on time, but I just wanted to also just talk a little bit about working with medical witnesses, the care and feeding of these doctors. And I think, a few things I've learned from having done this improperly in the past is that it's incredibly important to contact them and explain very clearly what it is you need them to do on a particular case. And then giving them as much of the medical record as you can of this victim, including the current hospitalization records and prior treating physician records and prior hospitalization records is really important because inevitably, especially in a neglect case, you're looking at not only what's going on with the patient currently, but you're looking at what their history is of accepting care and receiving medical care and also prior diagnoses and how that may have affected what their current condition is. We also want to give doctors a very clear picture of what this case is going to look like to them, what they can expect as far as defense interviews, trial, potential continuances, and then arrange a meeting to go to their office and really sit down with them and go over your direct examination of them and what you expect the cross-examination will look like. I actually end up working on my direct examinations with the expert myself, so I will send them a draft of what the direct examination is going to look like, and I ask them to help me clarify it and refine it, so I'm really asking the questions that will get at their opinions and the medical history as effectively as possible. And then I also, when I am going to trial, will ask the court to let me hard set the expert's testimony. So I'll ask for a specific day and time when this expert will testify, and will interrupt anyone else's testimony to get them in. So just as an effort to try to inconvenience them as little as possible. And then obviously keeping them updated about any changes in trial dates or any interview dates or anything like that. Anything else to add there, Laura?
No, I think we just have learned that there's lots of cultural differences between doctors and lawyers, and so understanding what each other needs is really, really helpful.
Right. So I think we're back to the idea of this being a really challenging but incredibly rewarding and important partnership, and I know that for me, I couldn't be prosecuting neglect cases effectively without healthcare providers, and I couldn't be prosecuting most other forms of abuse either, including financial exploitation, without this essential partnership.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that's nice for people like me is to know that there's people like you out there, Paige, to give us some hope that because we know that ultimately there are some cases that really deserve criminal prosecution. And knowing that that's going to happen with people who care is a really helps us from getting demoralized, and so we really, really appreciate it. I think this is our last slide, except for the links.
Yeah.
And I might just mention, Paige, if you don't mind, that I would invite anybody who wants to send an email to me to do so. My email address is just my first name dot my last name, so laura.mosqueda@usc.edu. I'd love to hear your feedback regarding whether or not this was helpful or things that you didn't like about it that we should know about, things that I can do to make this better in the future. I would very much welcome the feedback. And of course,
and I would join in that, Laura. If you could also let me know that. I really want to be improving what we can be doing to help people in this difficult field. And my email address is page.ulrey@kingcounty.gov.
Anything you send to one of us, we'll share.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Laura, Paige, thank you very much. If you have questions, Sid Stahl again, if you have questions or ideas are helpful, you please send it to elderjustice@usdoj.gov. And on the screen, there are a number of helpful links that you may want to take a look at to continue you're learning about this particular topic. There are a number of questions that people have asked, and let's go to a few of those in the remaining few minutes that we have. Senator Barnett asks, what do you initially, I assume this is addressed to Paige, what do you initially charge the defendant with when you initiate a case?
Well, it depends completely on the facts of the case, but we tend to not charge the sort of the lower level neglect cases, not only because we focus on felony cases here, but also because I think when you're talking about stage 1 and 2 pressure sores, it becomes all the more difficult to show whether or not they were caused by neglect versus the many underlying health issues and care issues that can contribute to something like that. And I also think it's difficult to get the jury to really care when you're talking about less severe cases, unfortunately. So most of the neglect cases I've charged have been either charged as homicide cases, so either as manslaughter cases or as criminal mistreatment, which is Washington State's version of neglect. And we've usually charged first or second degree criminal mistreatment, which means causing great bodily harm or death or creating an imminent risk thereof. So usually that's the kind of case that I think is clear enough and strong enough that we're going to be able to get a guilty verdict and that we should be charging on in the first place.
Dr. Lynn Duffy asked the question, I wonder about the rural communities, if there are higher incidents of elder mistreatment, as apparently Dr. Duffy has seen an increased number of clients in the last year. Do you know if that is possible, or is that unique to the circumstance that Dr. Duffy finds him or herself in?
Yeah, I don't know about that. We don't really know if there's a difference between urban and rural communities related to abuse and neglect. And so I certainly don't have any data to share. I do think it's sort of interesting because, you know, when you look at doing research, you want to decrease the amount of abuse and neglect. But on the other hand, if you're raising awareness and you're getting more appropriate reports as well, it can look like the incidence is going up when in reality it's just public awareness that's going up as well. So I would say it's hard to tell.
Yeah. And I would agree, being DOJ's research consultant on elder mistreatment, I've not seen literature on whether there's an increase in elder mistreatment in rural communities, whether it's reporting or real increase. Arthur Stevens asks a question. I'd imagine ER physicians are somewhat trained in these forensic markers. He poses that as a question. And I wonder, Laura, if you can address that in your experience.
Yeah. Well, there's a couple things. One, we need more research in order to be able to generate better training. But there are some things we do know, which I don't think is commonly made it into training yet in a variety of fields, including emergency room physicians and geriatricians. I think there's a lot more training that goes on related to sexual assault and child abuse, and in fact, nurses play a very important role in this as well. Finally, I'll mention that there are a number of superb emergency room physicians doing excellent research in this area, largely funded by the Department of Justice, and so I think you're going to see more and more work coming out in this area, particularly work by Tony Rosen and Tim Platts-Mills. Where they are working hard to improve their colleagues' ability to detect and diagnose abuse and neglect in the emergency department.
Okay. One last quick question that I'm paraphrasing something that Ralph Hernandez said earlier, or wrote earlier. Has it been your experience that HIPAA rules, or at least the physician's interpretation of HIPAA rules, has gotten in the way of physicians providing useful information?
Yes. On two fronts. One is it truly can interfere with just reasonable exchange of information. And the other is I think it is sometimes used as an excuse. And sometimes I think it's laziness on the part of healthcare providers who just use it as an excuse to not give information when legally they are completely allowed to do so. And if Adult Protective Services asks a physician for records, we are allowed to provide them those records. So knowingly or unknowingly, I think it's also sometimes used as an excuse when it doesn't need to be.
And I would just add that in any criminal case where we're getting search warrants from any state trump HIPAA. There is no concern about HIPAA when you've got a search warrant or a subpoena from the court. So it should not be interfering with our ability to investigate these cases.
So it's primarily a misunderstanding on the part of the medical community.
Yes.
Interesting.
Sometimes it's
Okay, well,
real, more often it's not.
Okay, I want to thank our two presenters this afternoon, Dr. Laura Mosqueda and Ms. Paige Ulrey. If you have additional questions, go ahead and send them to either Dr. Mosqueda or to Ms. Ulrey, and that as well as send them to that link that you see on your page right now, elder.justice@usdoj.gov, and we'll make sure that we forward them to the appropriate person. Again, thank you so much, the two of you, and thank you all of you for joining our webinar.